Good afternoon. So this is a period before lunch. So our goal is not to just inform, but also to try and keep you awake, especially before lunch. So the topic that we're going to talk about is inside the mind of the CIO. CxO, we're going to focus on CIO and CTO. So my original vision was, to basically wire them up, right? Why do we need to hear anything? But since this is a conference, let's keep it real. No longer, this is not virtual, we're going to keep it real. So what's interesting about my two cohorts here is that they have very significant experience in technology, right? Both have been buying and advising for a very long period of time. Manjeet, if you had a chance to look at his bio, started his career at P&G, was CIO at Chiquita, after that at Las Vegas Sands, and now of course at Clorox. So very significant global experience in a number of different sectors, number of different businesses. And then Mark started his career in consulting, was a partner in Deloitte, also was at Oracle, and now works with private equity, advising on mergers, acquisitions, so knows how to buy technology. So one of the things I like to do is really walk them through three things and get to hear from them on three areas. The first is, how do we see different kinds of CIOs and how they make decisions? The second portion is all about what are CIOs and CTOs buying today? What are their priorities? And then the third part is, we're going to talk about the sales process itself. So if you're a service provider, how do you get their attention? How do you sell to them? And I encourage you, instead of just listening, if you have a question or you want to add something, just raise your hand or just yell out, because I want to make sure you're part of this conversation and not just us on stage. All right? Great. So what I typically do is, my company advises Global 2000 companies on their whole sourcing life cycle. So we actually spend a significant amount of time helping CIOs make those decisions. So without further ado, let me just kind of give you a little bit of background. This was a conference that happened of CIOs in New York just recently. And this is what this group of over 100 CIOs said. And I think, Manjeet, you know the founder of this company, HMG Strategy, so you know where this is coming from. There was a couple of things that stood out to me is that the CIO is the CEO of technology, but more importantly, that every company is a technology company. Do you mind sharing a few views on that, how you think about that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I think, we've moved from the time where people struggle to program their video recorders, the blinking time, if everybody remembers that, to today, technology is embedded in our lives. A number of you are taking pictures here on your mobile telephone. You're using technology, and that technology is an enabler for you, not only in your personal life, but also in your business life. So today, as we talk to the rest of the business and the internal business users, we have to talk to them about technology because they want and need to understand how technology can enable them to add further business value. And that's a conversation we used to struggle to have in the past. Today, it happens more naturally, and if anything, it's them putting pressure back onto the IT organizations to figure out how can we more effectively help them.
So Mark, just to take that, if you think about your years advising leaders in these large companies, think about how CIO's role was then, which is 15, 20 years ago, to CIO's role today. How has that changed?
As most of you know who are in the technology business, there was a day when keeping the lights on was the most important job. You never wanted your computers to go down. You always maintain a backup staff. The key thing was you were an operations manager. The transformation has been rather dramatic. In today's world, CIO means Chief Information Officer. And that means providing, valuable information to your management team and your CEO in particular. So you want to provide information that creates value for your company. How do you do that? Well, you understand the data, you understand how to get the data, you understand how to analyze the data. And by doing those kinds of things, the value that the CIO adds today is much different than keeping the lights on in the data center.
I mean, so if you think about that point, right, which is, he didn't describe a CIO as running technology, running infrastructure. He talked about CIO that's providing data. So this was a research done by Deloitte when they looked at CIOs, they kind of put them into three categories. CIOs belong to three categories. They're either a trusted operator, which we kind of keep the lights on, a change instigator, that they do get engaged with business to make certain changes, maybe progress, and then a business co-creator, somebody who is actually a true business partner that helps the business propel forward, not just cost side. So Manjeet, what kind of a CIO are you?
I'd like to think of myself as a business co-creator because I'm trying to actually add value across the entire lines of the business, whether it's in our business units or whether it's in our traditional back office functions. And it's one of the reasons I love being a CIO right now. We used to have to fight for legitimacy at the table and get that proverbial seat at the table. Today, we're being pulled into it, and we're being challenged to act like a true business leader. You're a business leader who just happens to run the IT organization, just like you could be running another part of the business if you actually are thinking like a business person. So that's the way I like to think of myself.
So Manjeet, a few months ago, you and I were talking about one of your projects, that an IoT project, and I think it's a very poignant point, because if somebody was selling to you, they would have to think very differently about how they sell you on that kind of a project versus infrastructure. Can you talk about that story a little bit?
Certainly. So one of our product lines is Brita. If you don't know Brita, Brita is a water filtration system. So you buy a filter along with a pitcher. And our business had an idea around how do we make it more convenient for our consumers to replace the filter, which was one of the biggest barriers. And the IT organization actually partnered in with our R&D group to create what is now the Brita Infinity Pitcher, which is an IoT-enabled pitcher that measures and senses the usage of the filter and will automatically reorder through Amazon, so you know it's time to change the filter when the package shows up at your doorstep. The big breakthrough here was the fact that we were actually leading the product development piece of this. And not from what does the pitcher look like or what does the filter look like, but how do you actually create and enable the IoT capabilities, and what did that mean? Because we could have looked at it as just a simple sensor that reported some data out, or we could have used it as a learning opportunity to determine what else can we do inside a consumer's home, and how do we leverage that information to make even better products in the future. And it's a huge change from inside the organization, as we were talking about, in that IT would never have been involved in those conversations before, and now we're getting pulled into more and more of those conversations.
And so think about that. If you were pitching to him on that project, how you have to think very differently than if you were talking about a support and maintenance project, right? It changes the way you sell, the way you get attention. Mark, talk a little bit about, one of the things this survey talked about was how CIOs are different than CEOs. So if you were selling to a kind of keep the lights on CIO, how would you be selling to them differently than all these digital initiatives that are going on, whereas really the CIO cares about keep the lights on?
Well, today, one of the reasons that the CIO's profile is elevated is because we have something called security problems in our data center, or commonly talked about as cybersecurity. And that touches the risk management, nerve of every company. All the major breaches have been publicized. They've cost, millions and millions of dollars for corporations in settlements, in acquisition value, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're selling, to a CIO, even a CIO who's a lights-on sort of person, that CIO is still responsible for the data of the company. It's in his servers or her servers. It's in their storage equipment. It's accessed through their network. So I think one major selling point, into a CIO about your providing service, you also can provide superior security. And I think that's really a key point today and a hot button of most CIOs.
So maybe let's switch a little bit and talk about where CIOs are investing today. So I think it helps inform kind of what the priorities are. One of the things when I was looking at this, I was noticing is that over the last 5 years, the tech budgets are actually rising. Being in the business for about 17 years now, it's always exciting when you no longer just focus on cutting costs. that there's actually investment dollars that are coming in. And often we find that those investment dollars tend to not just favor the large companies, but it creates tremendous opportunities for the small companies. So this was a recent study done by Oracle, and let's kind of just go through it and maybe start with you, Mark. If you think about these 10 priorities that Oracle talked about, is there one or two that kind of stand out that you think are great opportunities for LATAM-based suppliers?
Certainly. I think the biggest thing for Latin-based suppliers, any suppliers around the world, is artificial intelligence. Because as we continue to think about why you would be selling into a company and why a company would want to buy, they want to get value. The value they want to get, of course, is lower cost. That's table stakes. But they want to get a more efficient, reliable operation. And the way we're going to get that, in the future is by having many of our things automated, have the machine learning, have this artificial intelligence applied to the processes that we have. I think that's an area that can be exploited, and I think it's a good opportunity for the folks here in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think number two is oftentimes a feel-good sort of statement, but really is the most important thing in any business. It's focus on your customers. And I think everybody who's successful in business needs to always remember that you have a business because you have customers. So it's not about, as the slide says, it's not about talking, it's about living, it's about customer service, and it's about creating that culture. And I think that's another thing that really plays well here in Latin America, and I think Latin American workforce is quite good at that as well.
We were talking earlier that about 30 years ago, which I know some in the audience were probably just a twinkle in their parents' eyes. About 30 years ago, many of us were actually working on automation. Now, the difference that we notice today more than ever is point number 4, where the velocity of change is tremendous. So, Manjeet, when you think about these 10 priorities that this Oracle CIO survey kind of established just this year, actually, what are a couple that you either struggle with or that you think an innovative provider could be of use to you?
Yeah, so I'll pick on number 1, which digital transformation is probably the number 2 priority after cybersecurity, as was just pointed out. And it's there that there aren't a lot of players who actually understand what digital transformation really means and can articulate it back to us. And what we found is that a lot more of the boutique players, the people who come from a more creative background, who are thinking really differently about the space, are the ones who are providing the most value. So for this audience, Latin America is a hotbed of creativity. There are things that you see here in this part of the world that don't make it to the other parts of the world because of the creativity, and I would love to see that being brought forward much more, because you're all living in a digital world much more than even some of us in the US are, because by necessity you've had to. There weren't the usual luxuries. So that's one area that I would say we really are looking for some help with. Number 3, I hate to say this is a survey by Oracle, so of course they're going to be talking about data, anything to sell more database. But this data problem has been around for many, 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 many years. It is now just exploding because we've got and collect all of this social data, mining Facebook, mining Twitter, mining Snap, all of the other companies. And the problem I have with it is I still collect a bunch of data, a lot of data, but I'm not sure I'm doing anything useful with the data. And that's always been the challenge, whether it's been financial transaction data, consumer purchase trend data, or now the social media data. And we need help. We need help for people to come and help put into context all of this data that we're collecting and make it meaningful and practical to my business. So it might be great to understand things like, smartphone purchase trends in the world. That's not relevant to my business. What surprisingly is relevant to my business is weather patterns. If you can help me predict where weather is going to move and what the impact is going to be in the different parts of the world, if not in the different parts in different states, that's a value to me. surprisingly, not a lot of people are doing that today. So they're just picking on those two.
Right. You know, interestingly, when I look at spend, particularly in Global 2000, you'll often see that for big ERP systems, most of the providers are the large players. And even in that environment, often, if you even go back to the last 5 years or so, the BI, the business intelligence spend, was often done with a smaller player, with a niche player. So there's, even in big environments, there's always opportunities, but too often suppliers fall into the trap. They go after the big market, not realizing that that's not where they're competitive. So we were talking about, Mark, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, is there's fundamental questions they should be asking themselves even before they start pitching to you on a certain service.
The first thing, of course, any of us do when we talk to a customer is understand the customer's business and what their needs are. So, you know, how does this customer do business? Do they do business locally? Do they do business through distribution channels and so forth? So the question is, what is the customer's business? And then, you know, you fill in where technology can make a huge difference or transform sort of the way this company is doing business. You know, Manjeet just talked about, you know, analytics or big data. Well, if you could figure out some specific applications specific to that business, you certainly have a leg up on any competitor. You know, one of the big things that analytics companies are doing today is by collecting that data and building algorithms to forecast various trends. You know, that's the beginning of what we have, you know, on the bottom side, which is, you know, the cognitive intelligence. You know, that's all the beginning of how we get the artificial intelligence information, which ultimately will really make us more productive. So I would say, you know, of course it all starts with what is the customer's business. Then if you can assess sort of their channels to market and their manufacturing or service processing, you know, where could analytics or where could your particular service really transform and make a difference? And I think those are two areas that are really on the minds of CIO buyers today.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
You know, I think there's one other important piece, which is identify the personality type of the individual that you're talking to. So we talked about the CIO, for instance. Figure out and find out, am I the kind of keep the lights on person, the person who's trying to figure out how to get closer to the business, or am I the person who's actually on the leading edge of the business? Because you're going to talk to me differently across those three different spectrums. For instance, if I'm just a keep a lights person on, you might want to be talking to me a little bit about cognitive and Internet of Things, and that's probably why it's so high on the survey here. But if I'm the more progressive CIO, I'm actually going to want to talk about things like blockchain. How does blockchain, how is it relevant to my business? Come educate me on it. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second is also understand where some of the pushes and pulls are coming from within an industry. So in my industry, which is consumer products goods, you know, we look at the big players and see what they're doing because we might want to be fast followers. So come talk to me about what you're doing with P&G. Come talk to me about what you're doing with Unilever. But remember, I don't have the dollars that they do. So keeping those kinds of perspectives in mind, understanding, as Mark said, my business, talking to me about the challenges I have is certainly important, but you have to put it in context of the type of business and the size of business I am as well.
Context. So I want to make sure if people have questions that I give you an opportunity to ask them. Anybody have a question or comment they want to make? Well, keep thinking right there. I'm happy to repeat your question so everybody can hear it. If you can just. Okay. Un momento. Please identify yourself.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
This is Sanjeev here, Sanjeev Jha. So my question is, usually in the IT, we have three big hats that CIOs have to wear, right? One is your IT, where you have to cope up with the new technologies, whether it's a IoT, or say artificial intelligence, blockchain, faster payments. Other side is your business, where business wants to generate revenue, have new IT, help them out. Third is your remarkable experience, where customer is looking for getting those kind of experience. How CIO builds those three together and bring them together to generate revenue?
That's a great question. I love it, right? And first of all, you have to make sure that you take the time to understand what your business really is and what the value drivers in the business are. Because as much as I love to talk about things like the Brita Infinity Pitcher, et cetera, that only started because we had the foundation elements of IT right. And the business saw the value of what we were bringing in that regard. That allowed us to create the relationships, to have the conversations around where they needed help, either from an automation perspective or some other type of IT intervention. From there, you build the bridge into, okay, now let me push you a little bit and push your thinking in terms of your role in the company and how you can be doing things a little bit more, either more broad-based or have more of an impact. But it all starts off with making sure you've got the credibility, because IT is doing what everybody expects IT to do, and that's the keep the lights on, and building the right relationships. I think a lot of people forget that we are all about relationships, whether it's a vendor-supplier relationship or it's an internal person-to-person relationship. If you don't have the right relationships, it makes it that much harder. So I always encourage my teams to make sure that they hire for technical competence where we need it from an operational perspective, but hire mostly from ability to build the right relationships.
I would just add to that. First, as you point out, all three are very important. And so as a CIO, you have to accommodate all three in your daily life. Now, the question is how you prioritize. And I think that depends upon the company and the company's goals, right? I mean, generally speaking, the objective of a company, whether it's public or private, is to increase the value of the stakeholders. And so what is the strategic plan associated with doing that in the company? It could be revenue growth. It could be increased margin through productivity. It could be that there's a question of you're so IT dominated that the security presents an unreasonable risk. So I think the question is which of those three and how do you prioritize those three? I think it's really dependent upon what's consistent with the company's objective and how you manage risk within your company.
And I think to add to that, we talked about the three different kinds of CIOs. What's interesting is there's many businesses where you can't just be one kind. If you look at a company like Time, Time, they publish Fortune, Sports Illustrated, and entertainment, many other magazines. If you think about and take a look at their last 5 years, their print revenues are declining rapidly, 5 to 10% a year, and the digital revenues are barely, making up that difference, not even fully making up that difference. It's a perfect example that the right CIO for that environment has to be somebody that can cut costs dramatically and at the same time be able to be this amazing digital partner, because that's the future of that business. If you don't do both, that digital part is lost to marketing or somebody else. And that's how shadow groups actually develop. But it's also a great opportunity for a partner, right? So if you look at their story, what you'll find is digital often is being carried out with a partner where some of these cost reductions, they might be actually trying to do themselves or through automation and other mechanism. So how do you kind of balance that? I wanted to switch a little bit to spending so I think people can understand where your priorities are first in technology, and then I want to talk a little bit about talent, like where are some gaps in talent. So this is again, Deloitte did this, and it was talking about the next 2 years, 17 and 18. So maybe with each of you, do you agree with these priorities, or do you see something that's missing?
From my perspective, I would agree with all of those priorities. I think each company is going to have slightly different levels in each one of those areas. Cybersecurity, for instance, some people are just in the process of catching up. Others are already out ahead of that. But what's interesting that's missing from here is kind of what I call go-to-market enablement. So when you start looking at Salesforce automation and Salesforce productivity and efficiency tools, something that has been stagnant for many years now. When was the last time anybody really came and talked to you about a dramatic new way of thinking around customer relationship management, et cetera, trade promotion management in our business? As well, while we talk digital and there's a lot of transformation going on in digital marketing, It's a lot of technology being thrown against traditional marketing techniques. And my challenge to our CMO is always, how do you think differently about the actual process of marketing, not the technology enablement behind it? Because I think there's a big opportunity there that is being demonstrated a lot by the technology companies in how to leverage that one-to-one relationship. And that's embedded in that digital piece up there. So I think from my perspective, the only thing that's missing there is kind of that go-to-market enablement opportunity.
And I think that, Sumanjit, I think what you're also saying is that highlights the need in some of these initiatives to have the knowledge of the vertical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were talking about this before. You know, in the past, IT is faced up against the business with more of a generic perspective, meaning a jack of all trades who's going to be talking to your salesperson, your marketing person, your HR, finance person, without necessarily having the domain knowledge. I think that has changed now. Because technology is so embedded into each one of the functional areas as well as in each of the business units, you actually have to have that domain expertise, because otherwise they're going to be getting their knowledge from partners or somebody else out of their discipline, and you are now going to be fighting against that. Versus if you are conversant with it, you're hearing the same things, you can put it in the right context for them.
Yeah, I would add to that, you know, totally agreed. I think the marketing side is underplayed in this survey. I think the other thing that maybe doesn't come out as much as it needs to is, because technology is so prevalent in everything we do, you know, how can a particular company improve their products that they sell into the marketplace? And typically today we see most improvements in products, you know, around technology and how technology is embedded in the products, you know, whether it's additional servicing for filters, you know, whether it's, you know, smart discussions on turning it on and off, you know, whatever it may be. So what I don't see jump out of that slide is investments in the technology surrounding the key products of the companies. And I think that's another area where, you know, surprisingly, you know, smart companies are beginning to spend a lot more money. Now, sometimes it's hidden in R&D, so, you know, perhaps it's not in that particular slide, but, you know, I think that's another thing just to bring forward.
You know, one of the things that really stood out for me was the API brokerage, right? It's a recognition that says there is, the way the platforms are developed today, I don't need customized APIs, and so having somebody serve as the API broker could be very useful. I see the same thing happening with automation. Instead of scripts being written that are specific to a company, specific to that particular environment, actually scripts that are easily used across industries, across companies. Interesting. So let's maybe switch to the talent side. And, you know, I see this often on the data side, for example, just the amazing shortage of data scientists. Pick any location. I don't care if somebody sells Bangalore or Mumbai or is selling Guadalajara. The reality is even those locations have shortages. So talk to us about, when you think about talent, do you always focus on large partners, or are there areas where you look for smaller niche partners? You know, Mark, maybe you can start that.
Yeah, I would say that niche partners are becoming extremely important today, because, you know, these technologies are so specialized as we, you know, go to the next evolution of advancement. So what typically happens? Well, you know, e-commerce is a great example. You know, today, you know, every company has some e-commerce presence, but certainly, you know, bigger companies, but certainly middle market to smaller size companies need like major resources in the e-commerce area to keep themselves competitive, to make sure that their products get to market, make sure they're properly positioned on Google, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing is, who does that? Well, you don't need to be a global provider to have expertise, you know, 50, 100 people specializing in e-commerce. And by the way, they're probably better than some, you know, junior person who got thrown into the e-commerce department in some big shop. So I think there are a number of opportunities where, you know, the sophisticated buyer will look for expertise, look for somebody who's really capable of satisfying their need. And I think niche providers have big opportunities today.
Yeah, I fully agree. By the way, fantastic time to be in technology. You know, it was true 20 years ago. It is definitely true now, and it's going to be for the foreseeable future. Just building on Mark's points, I mean, I think there's a different maturity level with different technologies. You know, back when SAP was new, you scrambled to find SAP expertise. Today, SAP expertise is a commodity. It's what you go for the big shops to. The niche providers actually bring you two very important capabilities. First of all, different way of thinking. And if I haven't overemphasized that, let me emphasize it again. Different way of thinking. It's very, very important today as a lot of our businesses are being disrupted. And then secondly, you're not bringing a I know how to do it all mentality, which is partly thinking differently, but also not reapplying what worked at customer A is necessarily going to work here. And that kind of agility and dexterity is very important. And one of the things that I look for, especially in emerging technologies, is to look at emerging technology and how it works in a mature market, like again the US, is very, very different than looking at how emerging technology works in an emerging market. You have to be much more creative. You have to come up with interesting solutions in an emerging market that are very applicable in the mainstream markets, and actually will help us experiment in the mainstream market at a lower cost point using different tools and techniques that could provide a competitive advantage. And that, a lot of suppliers don't come to me to tell me about how they can provide me with services that end up being a competitive advantage. They just come and tell me how they can do something faster, better, cheaper. And that's really the domain of the big players. And I wouldn't suggest that the niche players do that. Focus on that differentiating factor, which is your nimbleness, your creativity, and the fact that you are operating in different markets.
So let's dig deeper in terms of, you know, how do you get attention? How do you sell to a CIO or a CTO? And I'll pause for a second to see if people have any questions or any comments before I move to this in greater detail. All right. So keep thinking of anything you want to ask specifically, maybe something we've covered or you're dying to know. So let's imagine a marketing and sales funnel, right? I think maybe to provide greater focus step by step. So let's talk about, oh, there is a question. Thank you. Can we get a mic over there, please? Gerardo, we're making you exercise a little bit. Faster. Agale, señor.
Hello, my name is Maria, and you are talking about IT services. Then my question is, what about the operative activities inside the company? Do you think now CEO are thinking in keep inside the company that kind of activities, or do you think that kind of activity could be outsourced?
Great. So I think the question is about, you know, is there a propensity to now retain more of this or kind of bring it back, or is this, you know, you're still comfortable with outsourcing? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I talk about IT services obviously because that's kind of what I focus on a day-to-day basis, but I think it's a good question. From an IT service perspective, I would say it's mature. And we're beginning to ask ourselves the question as we're moving more things into the cloud, as I'm reducing the size of my data center footprint, do I need to continue to keep everything outside, number one? Number two, am I getting the most value out of keeping it outside? Meaning, is there more value in having my outsourcer do routine tasks or specialized tasks? And that bridges into now, how is marketing thinking about digital marketing? Are they doing that all in-house? Are they using partners? And I will say for the digital marketing folks, most of them are actually using agencies, which agencies can be thought of as outsourcers. And it's interesting that they're starting to make a play in that area where some of the traditional services companies, I think, can actually do a better job. It goes back to, do you know how to talk to marketing? Same thing, by the way, in sales. You know, there are aspects of sales that are being outsourced. I think what companies have gotten better at is understanding that balance of what do I want to use an outsourcer for, and what do I need to keep in-house, and then how do I manage my outsource relationship? So whether it's talking about governance, whether it's talking about skill evaluation of the resources on the account, we've all gotten a little bit smarter. And that's actually a good thing, I think, for the outsourcing industry, because you have a more sophisticated buyer who's willing to pay a premium when they see value.
Yeah, Maria, when you're in a company and evaluating what you want to do, I would say there are three basic things, right? There's cost, which is why a lot of people turn to outsourcing. There's expertise, which the company doesn't have, turn to outsourcing. And then there's risk, the risk of being able to fulfill the needs of the company. So when that balance changes, for a long time, risk wasn't high on the agenda. We didn't, think about hacking quite a bit. We had cost as something major, and expertise, whether that was in old COBOL programs that we had nobody who could, remember how to program in COBOL anymore, so we went to India to do that, or in that's brand new technologies where there aren't that many folks. Right, so those were reasons why outsourcing really took off. Now, depending upon where your company is, perhaps, the cost is not that different because you have global operations. You could be in India, you could be in Guatemala, you could be in Uruguay, wherever, Chile, et cetera, Costa Rica. So maybe there's no cost advantage. Well, what about expertise? Well, now if there's no cost advantage, perhaps you can get the expertise in-house, that perhaps you couldn't get before. And then finally, there's risk. Who's better equipped, to address the cybersecurity that's, prevalent today? And I think when you look at those things, you can make, you either make a good case for bringing things in-house, or you make a good case for keeping them with another provider.
All right. Any other follow-on questions? So what's the best example, Manjeet, you've seen of a niche provider getting, you getting to hear about them or know about them? What would be a great example?
I thought about this since we talked this morning. I had a niche provider come in and basically give me a whole presentation about how everything I was doing was wrong, and how my current suppliers were not going to meet my needs in this very, very specific use case that they had gleaned from conversations and interviews that I had done and the rest of my peers had done in the press. And that impressed me because it was more than what Mark was describing before, know the company, et cetera. They had actually gone so far as to understand my business well enough to give me a proper articulation of where I was not doing things as best as I could. That got my attention. Now, we didn't proceed with that, and there were a number of reasons why they were actually wrong in what they presented. But the fact that they actually decided to do that and made that upfront investment before even the initial meeting was something that definitely got my attention. What doesn't get my attention is an email. My inbox is way too full. A lot of vendors have also started sending you a box with, hey, if you take a call, this box will be filled with an iPad. I either throw those out or just tell my EA not to bother me with those. So those techniques aren't working. It really is highlighting your differentiation and making it meaningful to the problems that I have today that will get you in the door. And I'm also not the sole decision maker. So don't just count on coming to me. Come to my staff, because it's much more powerful if you've convinced my staff that you're interesting than it is to convince me that you're interesting. So I would encourage you not to neglect the lower levels of the organization, because they are very strong influencers.
Do we have any good stories of either from a buyer or provider in the audience that got attention? Mark, while they're thinking about it, maybe you do you have a good story of how to grab attention?
If you are selling, there's a old phrase, of why customers buy. It's either out of greed or out of fear. So what does that mean? Well, that means on the greed side that you offer an opportunity for a company to be more profitable. So by acquiring your service, company is, going to do much better. On the other side, it's, on the fear side, it's because you are doing something, your processes is not efficient as your competitors' processes. Your security is not as good as it needs to be. So there might be some reason why you're saying, gee, I really have a pain point here. So on both those sides, when you as a provider, introduce yourself to a company, it's truly understanding in that company and that industry as best as possible where are the real significant pain points. And the example that I would give right now is many of you know that there really is not a true global payroll system, as an example, because there are so many regulations in different companies that in different countries and jurisdictions that you can't process a payroll globally. You need people with expertise in every country, and sometimes within the country, many jurisdictions. So, if you had a solution that could aggregate local providers' payroll in a way that was inexpensive, so you don't have ADP and Paychex and all the large payroll providers taking a double margin on consolidation of local players, that's something that to me as a company could cut out, maybe 20% of my payroll processing cost. That would be significant. That would get my attention. So if you had something like that you could introduce, I think that would be a good way to get a buyer's attention.
See, Mark just used this opportunity to pitch one of his ideas. That's how you get attention, right?
Is that a full disclosure that I'm an investor in a payroll platform company called Payzar? Thank you, Atul.
So I think what I was trying to highlight, Mark, is when you have an opportunity, you got to take advantage of it, and I thought you did it well. So Manjit, you said something that I feel like if I think about the last 17 years of running my own company, I feel the only reason we've survived often is looking for those gaps. And you actually provided a gap to the audience today. If anybody in the audience can tell me what gap Manjit pointed out, I'm happy to give you a copy of a book at no cost to you. Did anybody catch the gap that Manjit talked about, that he's looking for some help? All right, I guess the book I'll have to keep to myself then.
They might just not have had enough data.
Yeah. Well, I think if they looked at your interviews, you would have probably talked about it. So if you remember when we were talking about the different skill sets and others and the programs, he talked about particularly around marketing and promotional techniques, right? And he talked specifically about go-to-market. So I feel like, often clients tell this story. Clients talk about where the gap is, what's important to them, and people on the other side don't listen because they want to just put that square peg in a round hole again. So, I know we're getting close to lunch, so I want to try and wrap this up, but take a look at this inverted pyramid and talk about what other advice would you have for suppliers, particularly in LATAM, that they could move from awareness to interest to actually intent. Give them some tips about what would differentiate them against others so they could keep moving into this funnel to a purchase.
Yeah, I would say that to move from awareness to intent, is captivating the imagination of the executive team. I think Manjit said it well. It's not about, just the CIO, but, it's important that you have the group of executives making the decision, sitting around a table in a room. That's first. I think secondly, it's important that you demonstrate the depth of your solution. So you don't just want the sales guy and the CEO of the company or the vice president of sales. You also want the subject matter expert. You also want the head of customer service. Because if you can demonstrate, very quickly to a potential client team or customer team that you have depth, you have knowledge, you're sensitive to their problem, and that you really want to work with them, I think that gets you the farthest, the fastest.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The other piece is recognize any time we spend with you is a time that we are taking away from other things, and it's valuable time. So make sure that your entire pitch is going to be concise, it's going to address a need, and that you're going to have a proposal at the end of it that doesn't amount to, well, just please buy my product. So one of the more effective ways to move through that funnel is to say, the old sales technique of, so what did I address your problem? Do you believe that I have a viable solution? If the answer is yes, I would be aggressive and move immediately into, so how do we get into a proof of concept stage? forget talking about the costs, et cetera, because now you've got me interested, you've got me intrigued, but you still have to prove it to me in my environment. And far too many times, people don't want to take that step as an investment during the sales cycle. They want me to invest in you. That's usually not very effective.
And I think as we end this, is there a question?
From me, if I may.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. As you may have heard from yesterday, and I'm Gerardo from the IDB, by the way, we have a platform at the bank that's called Connect Americas, where we are trying to connect sellers and buyers, mainly sellers from Latin America to buyers from all over the world. So now we have a service for our sellers where they can look for buying opportunities from major companies in the world. So how willing companies like yours and big companies in the world are to post RFPs from a new service or a new product in this kind of platforms, especially if we can help you to vet to these kind of proposals and suppliers?
Definitely interested. And in fact, one of the things we push through is almost everything gets through our procurement department, RFP'd. And it's challenging to find the right universe of vendors. And especially when you start thinking about international-based vendors. So to have a platform where I could put out my ask that's global in nature, obviously you talked about Latin America focus, and I understand that. That is incredibly valuable to me. I don't have the team that can surface all the potential vendors. My procurement organization isn't staffed to do that. It's a perfect example of where automation has and adds tremendous amount of value. So interested.
Gerardo, I'm really proud of you for taking that opportunity to sell that platform. And Manjeet and Mark, thank you so much for letting us probe your mind and giving us insights into how CIOs and CTOs buy. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.